Danny Truth Magnified. The first thing we got to address is the question of race. Is race real? Is it a real thing? All these different categories that we put each other into as human beings, black, white, Asian, African, European, and all the other racial categories we use to identify each other. Are these things real? And the answer to that really comes down to perception versus reality. Now, perception is the way that we view things or the way that we choose to view things. And perception can change from one person to another. What you might see when you look at something or what you might think when you think of something compared to what I might see or what I might think can be completely different, because perception is something that we create inside of our own minds. So it all boils down to something that's man-made, something that's created in somebody's mind, perception, which can be changed or altered. One day you might see that color as red. The next day you might see it as blue. You can continually alter your perception, but reality cannot be altered. Reality is what it is, and it's always going to be that way. Like the reality of that color, whether you see it as red or whether you see it as blue. Either way, it's always going to look the way it looks. You can't alter the way it looks. You can add something to it and turn it into something else, but that particular color is going to look the way it always looks, regardless of what you choose to name it. You cannot alter the reality of that. And if you tie this into the concept of race, you can see that the perception is that human beings are divided into all these races. But to even label somebody a particular race, you have to first use a word from a man-made language to do it. Languages and words that didn't always exist. Yet people did exist before these different languages and words. So what were these people before they were black? What were these people before they were white? What were these people before they were Asian, before they were European, before they were African? I'm going to put it to you like this. When you can find me a human being who you can look into the infrastructure of their body, you can look inside their body, and you can find somewhere inside of them black, white, Indian, German, Arabian. When you can find me a human being that you can go into their body and you can point out where you can see these racial identities or nationalities inside of them, then you'll have proven that race is real. Until then, everything about race that the majority of human beings have all come to accept is all based in somebody else's perception. And it has zero basis in reality. There is no reality to race. The only reality when it comes to human beings that we can see with our very own eyes, and there's literally no debating it, it's totally based in truth, is that we have human beings on this planet who have different phenotypes. So different shaped noses, different shaped eyes, mouths, and all different shaped body parts and different shades of skin, ranging from darker to lighter. That is the only raw, uncut truth about human beings on this planet. Everything else has been created in the minds of human beings and then passed down to other human beings who have then accepted it as reality, but really it's not reality. We can see naturally, again, when we look at human beings, we have human beings with all these different phenotypes, all these different shapes and sizes to their body parts, and darker and lighter shades to their skin. And you got human beings of different shades of skin that share the same eye types, nose types, lips types, etc. So looking at this, if you got human beings all across the planet who all share similar features, then really the only thing we got left that's dividing human beings is skin color. That's it. There's nothing left. Somebody watching this might say, no, language separates us. But again, that's also not based in reality. Language is personal perception. If you can't understand a particular language, you can easily learn that language so that you can communicate with somebody who's speaking a language that you may not understand at the moment. Remember, perception can be changed. Language is a part of perception. It's ultimately just sound. And all we do is manipulate the sound to create the words. And then we call it language. Skin color, on the other hand, cannot be manipulated. Not naturally anyway. Now, yeah, of course, people can unnaturally manipulate their skin color. That's perception. That's got nothing to do with what is real. You cannot naturally manipulate your skin color. You can try to pull a Michael Jackson or a Sammy Sosa, but at the end of the day, inside of your melanin cellular structure, you're going to have particular melanocytes that create a particular type of melanin. And again, we see this with people with albinism. They may not look like they have a particular skin color or melanin type on the outside, but if one of them has a child and the albinism disease isn't passed down to the child, you will be able to clearly see what skin color category that person of albinism fits into by looking at the child that they produce. I mean, you have all these different variations of colors that you see in human beings, and they all come from carbon. And carbon is black, 100% black. And then black itself is literally every single color combined together as one. And then with human skin tone, you know, the reason we see human beings as different skin tones is because of the different elements that they're either reflecting or absorbing. And with black, you're seeing every single color being absorbed. Meaning when you're looking at black, you're looking at every single element being absorbed. Because you can find every single known element on the planet Earth and outside of it, inside of the sun. And the sun itself beams out ultraviolet radiation. And from this ultraviolet radiation, we get light rays. And the light rays are just that. They're rays. They're like streams of light. And each one of these streams of light gives off a different color. And this is actually how we get our different colors of the rainbow, from these ultraviolet light rays. And each one of these different colors represents a different element. And then you have the color black, which is literally the absorption of every color. And then again, with these colors representing different elements, that means that when you see the color black, you're seeing the absorption of every single element. But then, like we talked about before, you cannot get brown from black without eliminating something. If you don't eliminate something, you're always going to have black. There's no way around that unless you eliminate something. Unless you eliminate a color, aka unless you eliminate an element, you're always going to have black. So the only way we could have gotten brown skin on this planet was to eliminate something, to eliminate one or more of those elements from the human melanin polymer. And you just keep removing those elements, going down the line of all the different lighter shades of brown skin until you finally get to white. And white as a color is just the reflection of all colors. So looking at that science, when you're looking at white skin or near white skin, you're basically looking at the fleshing out of all these different elements from the melanin polymer. So with that being said, with that simple science alone, we already know just from that science that black had to be first on this planet. If you have to remove all these other elements to get all these other skin tones that we see on this planet right now, then black had to be the first. Not the black that we've been programmed to associate with human beings all over the planet of different brown shades of skin, because that's really what we have. We have a bunch of brown skinned people walking around calling themselves black. When you look at that one particular color that we all see as black based off of the English language, and you compare it to quote unquote black people all across the planet, it's clear to see that we do not match up with that color. I just think to be able to understand the science behind human origins and why we are brown, you got to first realize the reality that we are brown. We are not black. I mean, if you want to get to true black, that type of black that absorbs all light, all color, all elements, you will find that in carbon. And we do see that to an extent in human beings. We got human beings that stretch really deep into the spectrum of darker pigmentation. We see a lot of darker tones out there. And they say the darker the flesh, the deeper the roots. And this is even backed up by anthropologists who are telling us that somewhere within the last 6,000 years, give or take 1,000, some type of change took place within the human genome, and light skin was literally introduced onto the planet. That it wasn't always here, that is basically a new phenomenon. And that prior to this happening, every human being on planet Earth was dark skinned. Now, how dark? They won't say. Is that based off of science, basic science of color? There's just no way we could have gotten brown or any of the other shades going down the line from brown without first having black. And when you look at the way the human body is constructed, the human body having every single element necessary to create every single wavelength of color, and then the very substance controlling the color of our skin, the pigmentation of our skin being dominated by carbon, the blackest substance on earth, it just looks to me like biologically the human body was constructed and human beings were created to be these dark matter beings, these completely black beings. And that this is what we started out with on this planet, that these completely black, dark matter beings were basically downscaled into something else. And MC1R is a gene that controls this receptor inside of us called the melanocortin-1 receptor. The receptor sits right on top of the melanocyte cells. And in order for it to be activated, it needs what's called a ligand. And a ligand is basically two elements that bind together, like hydrogen and oxygen or nitrogen and hydrogen. And in the case of the melanocortin-1 receptor, you got a peptide ligand. And to create a peptide ligand, you need nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. So that peptide moves onto that receptor and it binds itself to the receptor. And once it binds itself to the receptor becomes active. And that forms eumelanin. Now, if that peptide ligand never binds with that receptor, the receptor remains inactive and you get pheomelanin. Now, remember, light skin is something new. You even got anthropologists telling us this. So it's not as if this has always been an on and off occurrence in human beings. This is something that happened to a particular set of human beings at a particular point in history. This receptor becoming inactive. Scientifically, they actually say that this receptor is blocked in human beings who produce pheomelanin, because if it wasn't blocked in the person, then somebody that has pheomelanin could still possibly produce someone with eumelanin. It's literally changed the code in their DNA strand, specifically in that 16th chromosome where the MC1R gene sits. Once that melanocortin-1 receptor is blocked, that chromosome is changed for good. And then we've got TPC2, which means two pore channels. And a two pore channel is literally these two pores that poke into the melanocyte cells. And they kind of work as this gateway that allows sodium and potassium to move in and out of the cell. And basically to feed that cell, it's like food for the cell to keep the cell functioning properly. And this sodium and potassium just keeps moving through this two pore channel gateway until it finally sits at this set amount. And the sodium specifically has been linked to pigment regulation. So when you got a proper amount of sodium moving through these channels, you have fully functioning melanocyte cells, which means you also have a fully functioning melanin polymer. When these sodium channels don't regulate properly, that's when you start seeing variations in the pigmentation, and those weakened melanocytes can take you from black eumelanin to brown eumelanin. Now, I want you to notice something right away with both of these instances, whether you have brown eumelanin or whether you have pheomelanin. In both cases, the reason these two types of melanin are produced is because certain elements are being removed. With pheomelanin, you have a lack of nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen meeting up with that MC1R receptor. With brown eumelanin, you have a lack of sodium getting into those melanocyte cells. So it's just like we talked about at the beginning of the video. You cannot get brown from black or any other colors down the line. You have to remove something from black in order to get brown, etc. You got scientists that are doing this exact same thing right now, manipulating the melanin polymer. They create synthetic melanin, and then they manipulate that melanin polymer to create lighter shades of melanin by removing certain elements. This is human beings doing this stuff right now. So that's going to bring us to the story of Yaqub. Now we get the story of Yaqub from Elijah Muhammad. And the story goes that this information was passed down to him from Fard Muhammad. And this was back in the early 1930s when Fard Muhammad passed this information down to Elijah Muhammad. And we start hearing the information publicly from Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam in the early 1960s. And by 1965, Elijah Muhammad released the book Message to the Black Man. And in that book, we got this whole layout of Yaqub, some of the things they were breaking down with this Yaqub story scientifically and historically. This is stuff that we didn't know about until a lot later on, way past the 1960s. It's taken decades for some of this information that they were talking about back then to finally be released to the public as factual information. When you really look into this thing and all this information they were dropping, there is a lot more to this than meets the eye.
Again, I said the white man built a great world within the short time of 6,000 or 4,000 years. He had 6,000 years to build a world and to make slaves out of all of us, if he possibly could. He made slaves out of about 90% of all dark people of the earth. For 6,000 years, he has ruled 90% of the population of the planet. This is only the history. For 2,000 years, the white race was in the caves and hillsides of what is now called Europe. And he made no history in those days. He is the one that is referred to as Adam, that was driven from the Garden of Paradise. That is the white race. They are the Adamic people. They were driven out from among us 6,000 years ago after they had returned from a little small island in the Aegean Sea after their father had grafted them out there on a small island in the Aegean Sea for 600 years. At the end of 600 years, he grafted the white race, as they are called, by you. He learned that in the black man there were two people, a brown one and a black one. And while studying the two germs, he got the idea, if he could separate the two germs, the brown one from the black one, and graft this brown germ into its last stage, he could make a white man. Yellow, red, from those other two colors, I will carry him into the final stage, which will be pale white. After producing a white baby, there would be no other color that you could get from the black germ. That would be the last stage of the black germ. That will be a new person altogether. The white one became not of body. After being grafted, he became not one of either of these, black, brown, yellow, or red. The fifth color became an independent color then to itself, because it had been grafted out of the other four colors, namely black, brown, yellow, and red. This is the way this race was created, not from the dust of the earth, as you have a symbolic picture in Genesis there and in the Holy One. This is only to hide the real secret of the making of the man. Now, the black germ is stronger than the brown germ. The black germ is the original. The browner is a little weaker than the black. And the actual frame white of the man and the entire physical form was weaker than that which it was grafted from. Any time that you graft anything out of the original, the grafted is weaker than the original. The white race was grafted out of the original dark people and then made to rule the tree that it came from. And they have ruled the tree that they came from for the last 6,000 years.
Since we have no beginning or no end for the black man, no birth, how do you explain, and what is your doctrine on the origin of the Caucasian race?
Well, the Caucasian race came about, as they are called, white people. But actually, he was made white. This was brought about, we would consider just recently, to talking into billions and trillions of years. The Caucasian race, their birth is just here of today almost. That took place 6,000 years ago. The black man is the father of the Caucasian race. His name was Yaqub. They call him Jacob in English, but Arabic is Yaqub. He discovered in the germ of the black man that there were two people, and that instead in the germ, he learned to divide the germ. And he said, if I can take the germ now, this brown one, and separate it from the dark one, I can make this brown germ here rule the black germ until the black germ produces one that is greater than I. And he, being a very wise scientist, he knew what was coming in the future. So he says, my man will live for 6,000 years and he will rule his father. So this man discovered this, as I first said, according to the teachings of Almighty God to me, by the germ. And it still can be proven today that the black man have two people.
According to what Master Farad Muhammad taught me on the race question, the origin of the races, in the beginning of the races, they numbered around 4. And from these 4 races of people, they has produced many different types of people. But they are not, say, independent in their beginning. They came from one. We say today we have lots of various color people all over the earth. From, we say, from brown to white. we are not all the same color. And the origin of it, according to the teachings of Master Farad Muhammad, to me, was from a scientist, a God. We see him. We see him as a God. Back 6,000 years ago, started we say a scientific, or I should say, a master grafting work on the human being to produce a new civilization, a new race of people from the original race of people, our aboriginal people. This man, Yaqub, who discovered in the dream of the black man that he had two people in him, and that he had learned through study and experimenting on germs that this second germ could produce a powerful people that would be able to rule that which they came from. For around 6,000 years.
Some archaeologists were delving in the ruins of the ancient city of Troy. And it's the practice of archaeologists, to dig. So in digging down into the ruins of Troy, they dug deeper than they intended to. And they ran into the ruins of another city that had been there so much longer ahead of this city of Troy that it had gone down beneath the sands of time. And they had built this city of Troy on top of it, and when these archaeologists were delving in the ruins of the ancient city, they learned that there was one that was there more ancient than that. So they started frantically digging down in that one and dug below it into another one. And before they got through digging, they had dug down and they had discovered that civilization in that area had been there so far back into history. At different times in history, the civilization had been destroyed, had become completely covered up with sand and dirt, until another people came along and didn't even know it was there, and built another civilization on top of that. This happened 4 different times to give you somewhat of an idea of what the white man knows concerning the length of time man has been on this earth. And still that white man will come up in your face and try and make you believe that first man was made 6,000 years ago, named Adam. The white man's world is a newer world than the black man's world. The birth of the white race is shrouded in the story of Adam. The story of Adam hides the birth of the white race. And because you and I have never been taught to look into a thing and analyze a thing, we took the story of Adam exactly as it was, and thought that God made a man named Adam 6,000 years ago. That man, Adam, was a white man. But before Adam was made, the black man was already here. And that's not easy, that's not hard to see. The black man always sees, the white man will even tell you that. There's people that were here before Adam. And he always refers to these people as aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. It's 2 Latin words. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. And aborigine is only the term applied to those dark-skinned people who have been on this earth since the beginning of the universe. We're not aware that we were here before he was made. Can you understand that? Until 6,000 years ago. And 6,000 years ago, a scientist named Yaqub created another tribe on this earth. Understand? He studied the astronomical sciences, mathematical sciences, and the germination of man. He discovered that in the black man, there are 2 germs. In the black man, there's a brown man. In the black man, or the black germ, which is the strong germ, there's a weak germ, a brown germ. Yaqub was the first one to discover this. And Yaqub knew that by separating that brown one from the black one, and then grafting the brown one until it became lighter and lighter and lighter, it would eventually reach its lightest stage, which is known as white. And when it got to that stage, it would be weak. And because it was weak, it would be susceptible to wickedness. And then Yaqub could take that weak man that he made and teach him how to lie and rob and cheat, and thereby become the ruler of all the rest of the world. A new race would be made. And when Yaqub and his followers got after his followers realized that Yaqub was wiser than any man of his day, and they recognized him as a god. He was a god to them. This was the man that was made 6,000 years ago, and the purpose for making him was so he could rule the world for 6,000 years. So that by the time after 600 years of destruction on the island of Pilar, they had grafted away the black, grafted away the brown, grafted away the yellow, because the lighter they got, the weaker they got. As they began to get lighter and lighter, they grew weaker and weaker. Their blood became weaker, their bones became weaker, their mind became weaker, their morals became weaker. They became a wicked race. By nature, wicked. Why by nature? So that at the end of 600 years, of planting the seed of iniquity right into the brain, right into the mind, right into the heart, right into the nature of these people. By the time they got the white man, they had something that by nature hated everything that was darker than what he was.
Now, brothers and sisters, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad taught us that a black man was born 20 miles outside of the holy city of Mecca. And when he was a young boy, about 6 years old, he was playing in the sand with two pieces of metal. And he saw one piece of metal drawing the other piece of metal under its power. And there he discovered the law of unlike attract and like repel. And he said to his uncle, when I grow up, I'm going to make a people to rule you. Yaqub, when he became 18, he went to work. And he started teaching and getting followers there in Mecca. The object was to kill the black and save the lighter child, then marry the lighter on to a lighter, and keep on grafting until you produce a brown civilization of people. Birth control. Kill the black, save the brown. Marry the brown on to a lighter brown, kill the darker, save the lighter. Marry the lighter on to the lighter, kill the darker, save the lighter, until you bring it to its apex, which is this that you see, this Caucasian. Caucasian mean weak-blooded, weak-boned, stale-faced. That pale, what the Indian call a pale man. No? Brother, I am not playing. This is serious. The white man is not the real man. That's right. He's a made human being from you.
What we do know is that we have this man, Fard Muhammad, being credited as the first person to share this information. And Fard Muhammad is actually the founder of the Nation of Islam. He's the one responsible for creating this organization. But when you look into Fard Muhammad, things just get really weird. You can't truly find a death record for him. There's no obituary for this man. It's like he literally just disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, the FBI did an investigation on him, and through their investigation, they uncovered that this man had gone by more than 58 different aliases. They also found that through each one of these different aliases, he filed as either white or Caucasian. And when you look at pictures of this guy, he definitely does not look like what we would traditionally consider a black person. He basically looks white, especially when you look at what they claim to be some of his younger pictures. Now, was this a smear campaign? Were they just trying to defame this dude's name who had tried to do so much for the black community, especially during such a rough time period for black people? Me personally, I think they were trying to tell us something. I do believe that this guy that we know as Fard Muhammad was a white man. And one of the major things that exposed this was Elijah Muhammad's son, Dean Muhammad, stating from his own mouth that the Fard Muhammad that he saw and interacted with was a white man.
We believe that there is no God but Allah, and He will establish a government of peace wherein we all can live in peace. Now, that may be unclear, but I leave it there for a reason, because I still think there's a lot that we have to learn of what Master Fard Muhammad taught.
This was one of the points of division, or am I correct?
This is the main point.
The main point that you know.
I differed with my father.
Yes.
And I didn't want to differ with him.
Yes.
In fact, I never differed with him directly. I was told, he was told that someone heard me saying something different. Mm-hmm. So he called me to question me about it. And I told him that I could more readily believe that he was God than I could believe that his teacher was God, because his teacher was a white man, and he said white people were devils.
Or at least he was the front man for white people who are originally responsible for setting up the Nation of Islam and putting Elijah Muhammad in place. And I believe with this Yaqub doctrine, they were giving us a little bit of truth about how they got here and who they take their orders from and why they're doing what they're doing. First thing I want you to notice is in one of those interviews, Elijah Muhammad refers to Yaqub as a god. He actually says, we see him as a god.
The origin of it, according to the teachings of Master Fard Muhammad, to me, was from a scientist, a god. We see him. We see him as a god.
I think when he says we see him as a god, he's talking specifically about the people that are responsible for bringing that organization together in the first place, and the people that are responsible for giving him that information. Him and those people see Yaqub as a god. Now, so you got to put two and two together here too, because then you've got Malcolm X in another speech saying that the followers of Yaqub, the people that he had grafted down and implanted this evil in, that these people saw Yaqub as a god, that he was a god to them.
And when Yaqub and his followers got after his followers realized that Yaqub was wiser than any man of his day, and they recognized him as a god. He was a god to them.
And it isn't just this one instance or a couple of instances where you see the Nation of Islam refer to Yaqub as a god. In the book Message to the Black Man, if you go to the chapter, The Making of Devil, the chapter where they go in depth into the Yaqub story, Yaqub is referred to as a god there too, and not lowercase g, capital G-O-D, God. And you know, in the NOI doctrine, they're constantly referring to Allah, and Allah is nothing more than God in Arabic. So when they're referring to Allah, you gotta wonder, man, is Allah Yaqub? I mean, it just makes you wonder, man. Malcolm X was literally executed after leaving the Nation of Islam and going against the nation. And, he started opening his mouth and started saying a lot of things about this organization. And one of the things that he revealed was how the organization actually had ties to the Ku Klux Klan.
You mentioned conspiracy between the black Muslims and the right wing in this country. Could you elaborate on it?
I mentioned the conspiracy between the Muslims and the right wing in this country. I know for a fact that there is a conspiracy between the Muslims and the Lincoln Rockwell Nazi and also the Ku Klux Klan. There is a conspiracy.
Describe this conspiracy.
Well, the Ku Klux Klan made a deal, or were trying to make a deal with Elijah Muhammad in 1960 in the home of Jeremiah X, the minister in Atlanta at that time, who at present is the minister in Philadelphia. They were trying to make a deal with him to make available to Elijah Muhammad a county, a size tract of land in Georgia or South Carolina, where Elijah Muhammad could then induce Negroes to migrate and make it appear that his program of a segregated state or separated state was feasible. And to what extent these negotiations finally developed, I do not know, because I was not involved in them beyond the period of December 1960.
Are you inferring then that because of this conspiracy, the attempt was made upon your life?
The attempt could have been made upon my life. Ask that again.
Are you inferring that because of this conspiracy, the attempt was made on your life?
Not necessarily that conspiracy. The attempt was made upon my life because I speak my mind and I know too much, and they know that I will speak it whether they like it or not.
And he exposed a lot of things about Elijah Muhammad. And it just makes you think, what else would he have exposed had he lived? What other secrets about this organization was he holding on to? But whatever he knew enough to where they wanted this man dead. I mean, think about that. But you gotta think critically when analyzing this doctrine. And again, we know black people are not actually black. We're brown. We're lighter and darker shades of brown. But over and over again in this story, they keep telling you that the original man was the black man. And then from the black man, we then got brown. But see, they know if you're looking at this story through the man-made concept of race, where your perception becomes obscured and you see brown people as black, instead of looking at this thing through the science of color, you're going to totally skip over this and you're going to miss what's actually being said. So what they're really saying here is all you black people who are really brown, you were also a part of this grafting process. You were the first and you were the original ones to be grafted, but you were also grafted down to brown from this completely black God thousands of years ago. And you heard Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, even Farrakhan say it themselves. The further you graft down from black, the weaker the person becomes. And that when that brown germ was grafted from that black germ, that the brown germ was weaker than the black. And when you look at Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan, these are some pretty light-skinned dudes. They're not even close to darker shades of brown. So are these dudes seriously calling themselves weak, inferior beings? Why would anybody do that unless they're benefiting from it, unless they're gaining something? They tell us Yaqub comes out of Mecca, and Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, just underneath Iraq, pretty much right there in the heart of the Middle East. And deep within Asia, we can find Saudi Arabia and Mecca. And not too long ago, actually about 4 years ago, we did have anthropologists come out and say that based off of their studies, that it looks like the first occurrence of light-skinned human beings took place between India and the Middle East. Now, of course, what they're really talking about here is that blocked melanocortin-1 receptor and classified it as its own gene because it literally is changing the DNA. And they're literally referring to this thing as a mutation, a gene mutation. And that's just another way of saying everybody on the planet was originally one way and something happened that basically turned them into something else. At one point, everybody on the planet was dark skinned, and that something occurred that literally turned these people into light skinned human beings. But right here, you got anthropologists telling us that the first occurrence of light skin in human beings took place somewhere between India and the Middle East. Now, when you look at this name Yaqub, things get really interesting. You'll see that it can be spelled multiple different ways. There's so many different ways that this word can be spelled, and that it's the Arabic form of the word Jacob. And if you look at the etymology of the word Jacob, it literally means one that takes by the heel, a supplanter. And what is a supplanter? Well, let's take a look. A supplanter takes the place of someone or something that was there first. Supplanter often refers to governments and rulers of countries, and it comes from the verb supplant, which evolved from the Latin supplanter, meaning to trip up or to overthrow. So literally, this word supplanter is referring to somebody that goes in and takes over something that was already occupied by somebody else before them. It's basically talking about a group of conquerors. The word Jacob also refers to the Hebrews, the entire ancient Hebrew nation. And based off of the Old Testament definition, it means one who has been strong against God. As soon as we hit grade school, we start learning about Black American slavery. Sometimes they start pushing it on us before grade school. And really, it's been so ingrained into the minds of everybody, people in all parts of the world. and that the word slave actually comes from the word Slav, and that Slav is just a shortened form of the word Slavic, which is in reference to the Slavic people who inhabited Europe during the Middle Ages. This large nation who were taken in as captives so often and enslaved for so long that anytime somebody was taken in as a captive or held against their own will, that person was labeled a Slav or slave.
In the 400s to the 600s, there increasingly appeared a large family of peoples, the Slavs. They had already been expanding for centuries. Where their precise earlier homeland or place of origin was has really been debated nonstop by generations of scholars. Perhaps it was around the Pripyat marshes, close to where Poland and Belarus meet today. As they moved, the Slavic tribes diverged from one another, expanding west, east, and south. The so-called West Slavs would become the Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. The East Slavs would later become Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. The South Slavs included Serbs, Croatians, Slovenes, and Macedonians. Together, the Slavs are the largest language family in Europe. The name Slav derives from their word for word, meaning that they shared a common language and were mutually understandable. But there's also another tragic linguistic reality to note as well. In many European languages, including English, the word slave for a subjugated person actually comes from this ethnic name Slav. These peoples were raided and enslaved by their neighbors and sold in the markets of the Mediterranean world.
So they say that the Slavics moved into Europe somewhere between the year 600 and the year 700. But then when you really dig into this thing, you got a lot of scholars saying that the Slavics were actually migrating into Europe around the year 400. They seem to keep pushing this date further and further back of when the Slavics actually first entered Europe. But the main thing that they're telling you here is that these people were not originally from Europe, that when they came into Europe, they migrated into land that was already occupied. So they had to have come from somewhere else. And they're saying that's the big mystery. Where did these people originally come from? Where is their point of origin? Here recently, they are suggesting that the Slavics may have come from Western Asia about 4,000 years ago. And looking at a map, you can see within the region of West Asia, we have Egypt, Sudan, and the entire Middle East. And need I remind you that we have anthropologists saying that the first occurrence of this MC1R gene being blocked in human beings took place in the Middle East. You got a lot of scholars who actually believe that the Sarmatians and the Slavics are the same people, because the Sarmatians are recorded to have migrated out of West Asia into Europe between the 4th and 6th centuries, right around that same time that they're saying that the Slavics moved into Europe. And again, the Sarmatians migrated into Europe out of West Asia, specifically out of Iran. And they linked the Sarmatians back to an even more ancient tribe called the Scythians, who inhabited the Middle East before the Sarmatians. And they say the Scythians have the same lineage as the Sarmatians, that these are the same people. Because, I mean, literally, they're popping up within the same exact region within this particular span of history. But both the Scythians and the Sarmatians are considered to be this warlike, nomadic nation of people, because all evidence points towards these people being armed for battle and armed for being on the offensive, because they were constantly on the move, constantly moving around, constantly spreading out all across different regions into all these different lands that, again, were already occupied by other people. But they went into all these different lands armed for battle. And this is why they called them a nomadic people, because they were always on the move, always migrating into these new territories, into these new lands And they went in there as aggressors, looking to dominate, looking to take control and build on their empire. And they literally call the Sarmatians a confederation, an Iranian confederation. And a confederation is an alliance of a bunch of different groups. The only way you can have a confederation is to have a union of people that are spread out all across the board. So with them calling these people a confederation and calling them nomads, they're telling you right there that these people spread out all over the place. But it wasn't just some random act, that while they might have spread in the opposite directions, that when they went in and conquered new land, that it was all under this one union of people with the same agenda. And they also say that they had Caucasoid features. So for me, there's only one type of feature, and that's human features. We got human beings of different skin tones sharing all these similar features. We all got the same type of features all across the world, and we just have different skin tones. So there ain't no Caucasoid features, no Negroid features, no Mongoloid features. It's just human features, human beings with different features separated by different skin tones. Now, of course, you got certain people that have spread their genes across generations and generations over hundreds and thousands of years. And that particular genealogy or that particular phenotype stays in one particular part of the planet and multiplies over time. And then you have a bunch of people that share this same phenotype or those same facial features. That doesn't make them completely different beings. I mean, you yourself could spread your genes out over a span of thousands of years in one remote part of the world. And then everybody from your gene pool could come together and label themselves as a particular tribe, create a new language that they all go by, and pass down certain customs from generation to generation. This is what certain human beings have done all across the planet. And then we're programmed to associate these particular facial features with some particular race or ethnicity, or even just the way somebody should act if they have a certain facial feature. But it's just a really strong illusion that we've all bought into on different levels. And we got this same group of people being connected to the Slavics. And you got a lot of historians saying the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Slavics, these are all the same people, same history, different names, that they all come from a single root. And that this single root is also connected to the Aryans. And when you look into the Aryans, this is the same group of people that historically are said to have invaded India and other parts of Asia, taking over the original people of that land somewhere around 4,000 years ago. And again, this takes us right back to the first occurrence of that MC1R gene being blocked in human beings. And if these people were moving through Central Asia, invading all these lands, you can easily see how this gene could have spread all across Asia. And really, when you look at it, it seems like Asia was the biggest target of all these invasions and recolonization. And even when you look at the current populations within a lot of the countries in Asia, we know we're not looking at the original inhabitants of that land. I mean, within all these countries, you can still see remnants of the Aboriginal people. In all these countries, you still have pockets of dark-skinned people with what we would consider those traditional Asiatic facial features. And right near the tail end of the 3rd century, going into the 4th century, you got the barbarian migrations. And they call this point in history the migration period. And they say that when this migration of all these people into Europe occurred, that this took us from ancient history into the Middle Ages. Yeah, within this late 3rd century, early 4th century time span, you had all these groups of people that they say that the Romans labeled barbarians. You had them all moving into Europe and basically just taking over Europe. And all this was happening in this short span of time. And there was so many of these different groups of people moving into these lands that basically you could see how it was just overwhelming to the people that were already on this land and had already established civilization in these parts of the world. And from these original tribes that migrated in, you have so many other tribes that are formed from these original tribes, like the Avars and the Bulgars, the Vikings. You had all these groups of people moving into They say just Europe, but come on now. Ain't no way. I believe they were moving not just through Europe, but into all other parts of the world. And whether that took place within this late 3rd century, 4th century time span, or whether it started taking place later on down the line, doesn't make a difference. I don't believe these groups of people just stayed within Europe and didn't expand out. Now, what you'll find with every last one of these groups is that the earliest history they can give you of any one of these groups is their history in Europe. They can tell you about the civilizations that they established once they were already set up in Europe, but they can't actually tell you where all these people came from before making their way into Europe. Outside of the Huns, they'll tell you flat out, came from Asia. Now, most historians do not call these people barbarians. Again, that's something that they said that the Romans were calling these people. Most historians call them the Germanic tribes or the Germanic people. And again, when you try to look into the origins of where any one of these Germanic tribes or Germanic people come from, you can't find anything. They tell you the origin of these people is obscure, meaning they don't know. They don't know where these people came from. They haven't figured it out yet. But I think they have figured it out because it's easy to put 2 and 2 together. When you look at what we've already gone over, they tell you that the Sarmatians moved into Europe around the 4th century, that they had established civilization in Europe around the 4th century. Then they tell you that the Sarmatians are linked to the Aryans and the Scyths, and that all these groups are linked to the Slavs, who they also say moved into Europe around the 4th century. Then they tell you that the barbarian tribes moved into Europe around the 4th century. It would be safe to think that the barbarians or the Germanic tribes are also linked to the Sarmatians, the Scythians, the Aryans, the Slavics, that these are all one nation of people. Out of all these other civilizations that we talked about, they say that the Scythians have the oldest history, but the Scythians are actually linked back to an even older civilization of people in Central Asia that they call the Shrubna. But you got geneticists who hypothesize that the Scythian gene pool was formed from this ancient Shrubna population. And if the Scythians are descendants of these people, then that would place anybody else that came after them as descendants of this same Shrubna tribe that originally started in Central Asia. So the genesis, the start of all these other groups or all these other tribes, all these people that we just talked about would be Central Asia. First off, you can see here they say the ancestors of the Germans and also the current Central European Slavic ethnos migrated to Europe from Asia, and how these people are the ancestors of the German tribes. 9 times out of 10, they're talking about the Shrubna civilization. Then they start going into the reasons for these drastic changes in human beings. It says the biological reasons for the division of human populations was evidently the arising and accumulation of mutations. And we know with these mutations, they're talking about the malfunctions in the OCA2 gene, like we just talked about, as well as the malfunctions with the MC1R gene and the 2 pore channels, like we talked about earlier. And they say one of these anthropologists discovered different sets of mutations of the mitochondrial DNA in the Slavic and Germanic populations in the control region. The control region being Central Asia, where they said that they found this anthropological evidence of this ancient Caucasoid tribe. We have this section here that says, on the dendrogram of 16 population of Caucasus and some other populations, Greeks are in one subcluster with Russians. Now, the dendrogram is talking about this bracket found in this manuscript that has all these different ethnic groups on it. They're all grouped together on this dendrogram, and depending on how close one ethnic group is to another ethnic group, that indicates how closely related those two ethnic groups are, how similar their genes are, basically how likely it is that they come from the same gene pool. And in this particular case, in this genetic chart, the Greeks are right next to the Russians, meaning through their studies, genetically between the Greeks and the Russians, they found little to no difference. And of course, Russia is in Northern Europe, but Greece is all the way down deep into Southern Europe. I mean, you almost can't get any deeper. So basically, they're saying it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Northern Europe, Southern Europe, all these groups of people come from the same gene pool, from this same genetic mutation. It goes on to say this fact confirms the data indicating on mitochondrial DNA polymorphism data, the closeness of the Slavic populations and the populations of Southern Europe. Now, the mitochondrial DNA polymorphism data is basically what we just talked about a few minutes ago. Polymorphism is just another way of saying a large scale mutation, a mutation that affects a large population of people. If a change in the DNA affects less than 1% of the population, it's considered a mutation. Once you start seeing changes in the DNA of 1% or more of the population, they consider it a polymorphism. So here they are again telling you that this mutation in human beings was an event that took place on a large scale. Then it says on the dendrogram of 55 human populations, Greeks and Mari are in one subcluster. This at the first glance strange union can be explained by the fact that the Mari, who are real Caucasoid, may have been close to some ancient Caucasoid who migrated to Europe, most likely from Asia. Even 1000-year BC, the Akites, representatives of the Crete Mycenaean civilization, whose descendants are the Greeks. So they're saying that the Greeks descended from the Crete Mycenaean civilization. And the Mycenaeans are this group of warlike Indo-Europeans who basically invaded Greece, and specifically the area of Crete in Greece, somewhere around 4,000 years ago. And they invaded a civilization that was already established in Greece, known as the Minoans. And these historians literally say that the Mycenaeans took their culture from the Minoans, that they literally stole the culture of the Minoans and claimed it as their own after conquering them. And keep in mind, they're saying that the Mycenaeans are the ancestors of the Greeks, that the Mycenaeans went on to become the Greeks. So you got to wonder, is the Greek culture that we're familiar with today just the stolen culture of the Minoans? Now, again, they say that the Mycenaeans were Indo-European. And when you look into Indo-European, you'll see that they trace a lot of ancient European cultures back to one ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European. And they say that Proto-Indo-European most likely originated in the Middle East and then spread out into other parts of Asia and into Europe. Now we know that Greece was eventually conquered by Rome. Historians say how and when Rome was founded is a mystery, that they don't know who founded Rome. But they say that the earliest people they know of to settle in Rome and establish civilization in Rome were a tribe called the Latins. And then they also say that the Latins belong to a group of Indo-European tribes known as the Italic tribes. And they say that through the conquest of Rome, that the Latins united all of the Italic tribes into one group, and that through what they call Romanization or Latinization, they spread their influence across their empire. Now, just with them saying that they did this through conquest, that alone lets you know that the Latins couldn't have been the first inhabitants of Rome. Because in order to conquest, you have to bring other people under your control, meaning there already had to be people in Rome for the Latins to conquest to begin with. And that they spread the Latin culture out into the rest of the world through colonization. So basically by conquering and overthrowing the indigenous people that were already in these areas. Now, when you look into the origins of where the Italic tribes come from, it's really similar to the Germanic tribes. They say the origins of the various Italic peoples are largely hypothetical, meaning they don't know. They have no clue where these people originally came from before they moved into Rome. But we already saw, they're telling us that the Latins were Indo-European. And we already know Indo-European most likely comes out of the Middle East. And when you look into what geneticists say about the early Italic tribes, they actually bunch the early Italic tribes in with a couple of different groups, including the Mycenaeans. And they say that the people from these groups probably carried Nordic traits and had Nordic phenotypes. And Nordic is taking us right back to the Germanic people or the Germanic tribes. So basically they're saying that the Italic tribes and the Germanic tribes are probably linked genetically, that these are people from the same gene pool that just spread out in different directions. And what they probably will not say is who these Aboriginal people were. What type of civilization was this? Who were these Aboriginal Romans? Well, when archaeologists excavated ancient Rome and ancient Greece, one of the most prevalent things they found, one of the things they found all over the ancient civilizations of Rome and Greece, is what they call the amphora. And amphora is pottery, Greek pottery, that they would use as storage devices. And when they dated these amphora, they found that different sets of amphora came from different centuries. Now, the particular ones that we're going to look at are the ones that they date back to the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Now, there's a lot of places in the world that you can go and you can find this Greek amphora on display, where you can go and you can see this stuff for yourself up close and personal. But you got to keep in mind that you have your genuine antiques, which is what archaeologists actually excavated from those ancient sites. And then you have your reproductions, which are basically just fake replicas of the original antiques. So we're going to go to where they say we can find the genuine antiques. And to find those, they say we got to go to the British Museum in London, England. And they have about 4 or 5 different rooms that are specifically dedicated just to this Greek amphora. You can see the imperfections in the pottery, like chipped pieces in the clay, cracks in the vases where they've taken fragments that they've excavated and put them together to reconstruct the amphora. But overall, you can clearly see the images painted on these amphora. And even the signatures written in Greek of the painters who painted each individual amphora. And these amphora depict all these different aspects of Greek and Roman culture. You got depictions of people doing everyday things that you would expect to have seen people within that Greco-Roman culture do during that period in time. You've got depictions of people riding horses, playing instruments, doing different types of manual labor. You got the Greco-Roman wrestlers being depicted, people interacting with all different types of animal life. You've even got depictions of people looking like they're getting ready to go to battle, or like they already are in the middle of a battle. But we have all these things depicted on this amphora, all these different things that you would expect to see when looking at depictions of Greco-Roman culture during that time period. And we even have depictions of things taken straight out of events from Greek mythology. But the one thing that stands out, and I already know everybody watching this already picked up on this the second that first amphora popped up on the screen. The one thing that stands out about these depictions is that all the people depicted on these amphora are black. And some of you might be saying, well, maybe that was just a standard style for painters during that time period, you know, painting these characters in black so they'd be more detailed and more visible. And they weren't actually trying to convey the actual pigmentation of the skin of these people that they were painting. But if that's the case, then you got to explain why on quite a few of these amphora, we also have depictions of what clearly looks like very fair-skinned people interacting with these people with black skin. We have depictions of these fair-skinned people and these people with black skin side by side on these amphora interacting with one another. And these people with black skin are painted the exact same way that they're painted on the amphora when you just see them by themselves. Same style. The only difference is that on some of these amphora, we have these fair-skinned people inserted in. And truth be told, you got quite a few cases where you see these fair-skinned people, and it is so clear that the images have been tampered with, that somebody tried to paint over what were originally black characters and repaint them as white. But they did a crappy job because you can easily see all the markings where they tried to cover it up. You can still see remnants of the original black character. So with some of these fair-skinned characters that you see on this amphora, you got to question, were they even originally fair-skinned? And if this was just a technique that these painters were using to add more detail to these characters and just kind of create a silhouette of these people, then why go through all the trouble of trying to cover it up? Why would you attempt to change the pigmentation of these characters if the pigmentation of the characters was never relevant in the first place? Now, when you look into the specific technique used to paint these amphora, they call it black figure pottery. Now, if that's not putting it plain enough, historians say that black figure pottery originated in the 7th century and that this particular technique continued to be used all the way up until the late 5th century. And then from the late 5th century, the Greek and the Roman painters switched over to a technique that they label as red figure pottery. And as you can see with red figure pottery, the most distinctive thing about this particular pottery is no more black characters. The black characters have been removed. And the timeline is important here. Again, from the 7th to the late 5th century, historians are saying that the Greek and Roman painters were using black figure pottery to portray Greco-Roman society. And then for some reason, late in the 5th century, going all the way to the 3rd century, the Greek and Roman painters switched to red figure pottery. And again, with red figure pottery, those original black figures on that amphora, completely removed, completely abandoned. And what do you know? Historians say that in the early 5th century, the Latins and all the other Italic tribes had joined together and began to impose themselves onto Rome. And clearly we can see that the images of the Romans do change drastically right within that 5th century time period. So if the Latins and the Italics begin to colonize Rome within that 5th century time span, and we can clearly see that drastic change in the imagery within that same time frame, I think it's safe to assume that the Aboriginals of Rome were dark-skinned people. So we're talking about Babylon, Assyria, Acadia, Sumer, and all these other ancient civilizations in the Middle East. And we can even put ancient Egypt in this because it was in that same region and within that same span of history. Now, it's this region that they historically consider to be the cradle of civilization, that this is where the beginning of civilization first took place. And not the beginning of human life, but actual civilization, which is talking about the development of an advanced social structure and an advanced culture. This is where historically they say it got started, in the Middle East, and specifically in what they call the Fertile Crescent, which is this crescent-shaped region in the Middle East where they say that these early civilizations got started. And out of all of these civilizations, they credit Sumer as the oldest. They say that Sumer is the earliest known civilization on planet Earth, even older than ancient Egypt. And they say this because they claim that everything that they've been able to put together from all the archaeological evidence that they've recovered from all of these different areas, Sumer to them looks like it was the first civilization to create a form of writing and to have an actual written language and build complex structures that they developed into cities, and to have some type of complex society where they actually have some form of a government and some type of a social order. All of these aspects of modern civilization that we're so accustomed to today, they say that it all started with the Sumerians. And by the way, they say that this first civilization, the oldest known civilization on planet Earth, originally started somewhere around 6,000 years ago. And from everything we've gone over so far, clearly that doesn't make any sense. We've got anthropologists telling us over and over again that there were people on this planet long before 6,000 years ago. Of course, they're lying. They're essentially just saying that everything past this certain time frame doesn't matter. They're covering up the past, anything past 6,000 years ago. And essentially they're saying history starts here with the Sumerians. And it's because this is where they start. This is where their history starts. When archaeologists first started excavating ancient Mesopotamia, they came across these fragments of these clay tablets that had what looked like symbols on them. They kept on finding more and more fragments of these clay tablets. And eventually they say that they figured out that these symbols were actually a form of writing for the people in ancient Mesopotamia. So you had people going to work trying to decipher these tablets. And they say that after 20 years of trying to decipher these tablets and figure out what they meant, this guy named Henry Rawlinson finally cracked the code. And he was the first to be able to read the writing on these tablets. And the first one that he deciphered is what they call the flood tablet. And the crazy part is that they say that the flood story on this tablet is almost identical to the flood story in the Bible, in Genesis. The only difference being that on this tablet, you have more than one God, multiple gods who come together and decide to send this flood out. Whereas, of course, with the biblical version, it's only one God, or at least it seems like it's only one God. And instead of Noah being the sole survivor of this flood, we have Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh just so happens to be a hybrid between the gods and humans. But they recovered a lot more fragments of these tablets. And eventually they say that they realized that they had recovered two separate sets of tablets that told two different creation stories. Another crazy similarity to the Bible, which also has two separate creation stories. But between these two tablets, you've got the Eridu Genesis, which was found in Sumer, which immediately starts with the gods, multiple gods, creating what they call the black-headed people and giving them rulership over the entire earth. And eventually the gods become displeased with these black-headed people. And that's when they decide to send the flood and these people are wiped out. Then on the other side, you have the Enuma Elish, which was found in Babylon. And this story starts out a little different. It starts out with the gods at war. Now, remember, in the Eridu Genesis, the gods are already in disagreement about sending this flood. So when you get to the Enuma Elish, the gods start out right away at war with each other. Now, a battle ensues between two of these gods, and one of the gods is killed in this battle. And the one that's left standing becomes king of the gods, Marduk. And Marduk and the rest of these gods take the blood of this god that was killed and they create humankind. And they're created to serve the gods. And remember, Gilgamesh, this hybrid between the gods and humans, survives this flood that wipes out the black-headed people. Now, eventually you had this archaeologist and scholar named Zecharia Sitchin come in and decipher these tablets even further. And from all his research, he said, forget about the blood of the gods. The Enuma Elish is actually talking about human beings being genetically modified by the gods, that these gods altered the DNA of Cro-Magnon man. So basically the cavemen that existed before human beings evolved into civilized man. And from this manipulation of DNA, we got civilized human beings. And he said from his research, these gods were actually extraterrestrials. Now you got a lot of archaeologists and historians that do not co-sign Zecharia Sitchin, that say that his interpretation is off. And personally, I think that's because they realize what you can put together when you connect what he's saying to all the rest of this history and science and everything else. But the one thing that you're going to find, they are telling you about themselves. The more you know, the more you realize with all this information that they put out here, they're telling you who they are and where they came from. And this is exactly what you get from their interpretation of the Sumerians.
What if much of this supposed recent knowledge lay secreted away in the ruins of a once powerful society, awaiting our discovery? Could this alleged new knowledge uncovered in Earth's little corner of the universe be considered Genesis revisited? This is the belief of the world-renowned archaeologist, linguist, and expert in the field of cultural anthropology, Zecharia Sitchin.
I'm Zecharia Sitchin. I devoted a lifetime to the study of ancient civilizations, ancient languages, their art, their beliefs, and the knowledge that they had. And the question is, when you study, when you look at all that, is it myth, is it mythology, or did it really happen? I believe it all really happened.
Thanks to the science of archaeology, experts now know that the first great civilization emerged almost 6,000 years ago. Older than the Greeks, older than the Mayans, older than the Incas. The people of this society were called Sumerians, after their land, Sumer, in the Great Plain between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, today's Iraq. The book of Genesis calls the land Shinear. For generations, biblical scholars either ignore biblical references to ancient kingdoms or categorize these as legend or lore. Through the study of historical relics and the translation of ancient languages, many biblical researchers now believe that the previously questioned Old Testament references are indeed historically authentic accounts of flourishing, advanced cultures.
The Sumerian civilization emerged in what is now Iraq about 6,000 years ago. They provided the basis for every great culture that followed them, starting with the Babylonians and Assyrians and on, up to our own modern society. Every aspect of civilization that we consider essential had its first in Sumer. Writing and mathematics, the wheel, the kiln, brick-making, high-rise buildings, kingship, codes of law, astronomy, and much, much more. Many cultures struggled for centuries to advance and to develop, but the Sumerian civilization appeared almost overnight as if planted there. Most amazing was the Sumerian knowledge of astronomy. They knew of all the planets we know of today, described them in texts, and even depicted them correctly by location and size.
Zecharia Sitchin's research reveals that in our ancient past there were advanced beings referred to as the Anunnaki, translated, those who from heaven to earth came.
The idea that there was in our solar system a race of intelligent beings far older than us who are now gone would certainly force us to rethink lots of questions, including the question of human origins. Where did we come from? Could we be the products of genetic engineering?
The hypothesis that modern science is only now catching up with ancient knowledge is inspiring scientists and researchers to increase efforts to rediscover that which may have been lost over time.
It rekindles a situation that has lain dormant almost 5,500 years.
If you study the Genesis document, God made Adam out of clay and then took Eve out of his rib, one of his ribs, etc. If you study this document, you discover that it is really a much shorter version of a much more complicated document that comes out of Babylonia and then out of Sumer and so on. Now, these ancient texts give a really complicated story of powerful godlike beings actually engineering us, making us for specific purposes.
Zecharia Sitchin's investigation into these cultures brings him to this 6,000-year-old temple in an excavated area of the ancient city Erech. Until its discovery only 150 years ago, Erech was known only through passages in the Bible. The temple is dedicated to a female goddess named Inanni, also referred to in later times as Ishtar. Zecharia Sitchin.
You can see here her features a little damaged. Her divinity was marked by the pair of horns that she had. She held a jar with the water of life, and she was surrounded as a decoration, but perhaps also symbolically, with a symbol that some refer to as entwined snakes, which was the symbol of science in those days, 6,000 years ago. Some find in it a precursor of the Egyptian Ankh, which was the symbol of life and creation.
Further results of Mr. Sitchin's research affirm the theory that this visage of entwined snakes is the symbol for genetic manipulation of DNA. In ancient Mesopotamia, the secrets of astronomy and other celestial knowledge are kept carefully guarded, studied behind closed doors by an exclusive society of priest astronomers. How was Adam created? According to the Sumerians, it was by genetic engineering.
Adam was the first test tube baby.
Directed panspermia, another scientific theory, suggests that life on Earth is seeded by a race of beings from outside the planet, not by chance, but as the deliberate activity of an otherworldly society. The Bible suggests that the creation of humankind comes at the end of a long list. in the last few pages of the story of creation. The Sumerians point to the Anunnaki as the creators of mankind, our own benefactors of life.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three great Western traditions, religious traditions, are all founded on the idea that there's something special about human beings. We didn't arrive here accidentally, so we're not just some consequence of billions of years of pointless accidental permutations of life forms. No, we were created in the image of God. Now, what if it were the case that there were creatures both technologically more advanced than us, older than us in terms of their civilization, and maybe even more intelligent than us, and more spiritually advanced, if we could imagine that? Then would this cause the creation story to collapse and leaving, literally billions of people on the planet totally confused about the meaning of life?
So they're saying that the Sumerian civilization started around 6,000 years ago. And then on the other end, we got scientists telling us that white skin was introduced onto the planet somewhere around 6,000 years ago. So it's clear to see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to place themselves in the position of the Sumerians. They're trying to say that they are the Sumerians, this very first advanced civilization on planet Earth. I mean, you heard Zechariah Stitchin. Many cultures struggled for centuries to advance and to develop, but the Sumerian civilization appeared almost overnight, as if planted there. They're talking about themselves. It's not hard to see. And then you have Zechariah Stitchin come in and make that even clearer by saying that the Sumerians were placed here by these extraterrestrial gods that manipulated the DNA of the human beings that were already here, which is obviously a reference to those mutations within the human DNA that led to them. Now, it's like I was telling you, they're saying that the Sumerians started at 6,000 years ago because this is where their history starts, right there in that Fertile Crescent with the Sumerians and all the rest of these ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. Now, right away, one thing that we can easily conclude is that they were not the Sumerians. The Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of these Mesopotamian civilizations were dark skinned. And how do we know that? Well, we can look at the ancient artifacts from these civilizations and we can see how they depicted themselves. And looking at the artifacts from all of these ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, when you see how these people depicted themselves, it's clear to see that these were dark skinned people. But what they are telling us by giving this particular civilization a 6,000 year starting point is that this is where they begin to invade. This is where it all started. All the invading and colonization, it all started here. There's a lot of people watching this who were already familiar with the Sumerians, but there's another Mesopotamian tribe that for whatever reason you never hear about called the Cimmerians, this Indo-European tribe of nomadic people that they say came out of the Pontic Caspian steppe, which is literally just this flat plain of land going north of the Caucasus Mountains. No trees, no mountains, no caves, just a flat plain of land. But just beyond the Pontic steppe is the Pontic Mountains. And the Pontic Mountains are in the Middle East, in the northern region of Turkey. And they say that these people came out of this region and began to invade Mesopotamia. And that the first people to record this invasion were the Assyrians. They say that the Cimmerians came in and they began to threaten the kingdoms of these Mesopotamian civilizations. They say they invaded Urartu, which is now Armenia. They say they invaded that land, looted the country, and then moved on to a kingdom in Turkey. And then after invading and tearing down these kingdoms, they settled in and started to build up their own kingdoms on the same land. And they would just continue to move through Mesopotamia and invade and conquer and destroy all of these kingdoms. They say that each and every one of these Mesopotamian civilizations recorded one of these laments. Each and every one of these civilizations is breaking down how their civilizations were invaded and destroyed. And in the translation that they give, they say that these people referred to these invasions as a storm brought on by the gods. Remember the flood that took out the black-headed people, brought on by the gods in the Eridu Genesis. All this is tying together. And we already know a flood doesn't necessarily have to be water. With the flood, we can also be talking about a large quantity of people moving in all at once. And they all talk about the gods basically abandoning these civilizations and allowing this storm to come in and destroy these civilizations. But based off of the history of who we know they say invaded ancient Mesopotamia, we can assume that they're talking about the Sumerians. But was it really just the Sumerians? Well, the only way to figure that out is to figure out who the Sumerians were. Well, historians are saying that the Sumerians were closely related and archaeologically almost identical to the Scythians. And this is because of anthropological research that's been done on the genome of both of these tribes, which suggests that they come from the same gene pool. And that so, of course, they also share a genetic link to the Sarmatians and the Shrubna, all of these ancient tribes of people that are genetically linked to the Germanic tribes, aka the barbarians. They say that the Sumerians are a part of this same gene pool. You can see it says that our results suggest that the Sumerians were largely similar to the more eastern Sarmatians, albeit an increased amount of Siberian component, thus representing a genetic link between the Iron Age people of the Kazakh steppe region, similar to the Cis-Uralic Shrubna Alakulskaya. Sumerians were not direct ancestors of the Scythians in the Pontic Caspian steppe. However, all those populations shared a common ancestral gene pool. So they're telling you this is the same lineage of people. The same people that invaded Europe and went on to invade Africa and America are the same people that invaded the Middle East and the rest of Asia. They all came from this one single gene pool. Many different names, same people. And this is the ultimate example of how race is an illusion. Just the way these geneticists trace these ancestral roots tells you everything. They're not going by who was a Jew or who was a European or none of that. They're not looking at people's nose sizes and lip types and all this stuff that we separate people with. The only thing they look at is mutations within the DNA. If this ancient group of people shares these same mutations, then they know that these people come from the same gene pool. That's all they need, because they know what a lot of people have yet to accept, that race is not real. What we have is human beings that have mutated from the original human beings. And this all centers around melanin and that melanin polymer carrying all of those amino acids and proteins and all of those basic elements found within the structure of the human body. All we have is human beings who have varying degrees of mutations within their melanin cellular structure. And these mutations have led to these two very distinct forms of melanin that separates human beings all over the planet. And it's almost like they're trolling us with these names, the Sumerians and the Cimmerians. It's literally just a play on words. You have the Sumerians, who we can assume were the original inhabitants, and you have the Cimmerians who conquered them and basically took their identity. Some of you watching this are probably old enough to remember the movie Conan the Barbarian, about this barbarian warrior who goes off to avenge the death of his parents and his tribe. But Conan the Barbarian, the movie, actually comes from much older source material. And that source material was a 1932 animated character called Conan the Cimmerian. And Conan the Cimmerian was born on the battlefield. He was raised to be a warrior, and eventually he became the leader of his tribe, the Cimmerians. And there was quite a bit of fantasy in there, but a good portion of it revolved around Conan leading his units of warriors into all these different lands that they would invade, conquer, and take over. And a good portion of these people in these kingdoms that they would invade looked like natives. And Conan and his forces would go into these lands, completely wipe out the inhabitants, and then claim whatever was left of these civilizations that they destroyed. I mean, they're literally giving you the history in the form of a cartoon. It's all right there. And then they would go on to market this same character as a hero through Hollywood and even through some of the more popular comic books. Earlier, when we were talking about Yakub, I was flashing up these images of all of these white men, all with different phenotypes and different facial features, with these fezzes with the words Islam and Mecca written across the top. Well, all of these men belong to a branch of the Freemasons called the Shriners. And outside of Islam and Mecca, they have insignia written across these fezzes that point back to all these different regions within the Middle East and the rest of Central Asia. And like I said, the Shriners are a branch of the Freemasons. But the crazy part about it is you have to first be a master Mason to even be considered for becoming a member of the Shriners. And again, the Shriners are completely centered around Central Asia and the Middle East, which seems to be where these people first popped up on the planet, and the very same regions where the invasion of dark-skinned people started and where the spreading of the light-skinned gene began.
Well, as they say, in the beginning when the shrine was formed, go back into the 1870s when New York was quite a popular place for just about everything going on in the world at that time.
The Civil Wars ended, and in America's biggest city, New York City, a group of Masons comes together who think that it's great to be a Mason, but that lodge meetings are a little bit on the stuffy, stale side. They meet regularly for lunch at a place called the Knickerbocker in New York City, Manhattan, and decide that they need to form a club that will require you to be a Mason to be a member of it.
We had two very prominent people who were really the movers and shakers to start the organization. Billy Florence, who was a very famous and well-known actor at that time, and Dr. Fleming, who was a very prominent physician in New York City.
They were familiar with some of the customs and culture of the Middle East, and they decided that they would wrap this club that they were about to form around an Arabian Nights sort of pageantry kind of theme. And so the ancient Arabic order Nobles of the Mystic Shrine is born as a social club for Freemasons in New York City. It grows from there.
The Fez comes from Morocco. The name of the city is Fez, Morocco. The emblems, the scimitar, the crescent, and so on, is taken from basically the various parts of the Arabic nations. It was the mystique part of it, I think, that was intriguing to a lot of people, both outside of Masonry and inside as well, of course. And that was, I think, a great drawing card.
George Washington, your humble servant. We are at a building that bears my name and honors a group of extraordinary men. They were kings, generals, scientists, artists, philosophers, business tycoons, astronauts, literary giants, 13 of the founding fathers of these United States of America, including myself, the first president of the United States. Well, that should have been accomplishment enough, but these men wanted to do more. Since the first Grand Lodge was formed in England back in 1717, the members of the Masonic fraternity have been united by a driving desire to make a difference in a world where good often seemed to be in short supply. But you do not have to be an eminent statesman or a Fortune 500 CEO to become a Freemason. Masons come from a wide variety of economic and political backgrounds. They are all men of faiths, but this is not a religious organization. For any man seeking to improve his life, the Brotherhood of the Masons is an inspired choice. And yet, within that elite organization, there is a group who originally came together to simply enjoy a little high-spirited fun. and without losing sight of that goal, developed what became known as the world's greatest philanthropy. They are the Shriners.
Are you looking for more in your life? Do you want to do something different, something fun, but deeply worthwhile? Are you ready to develop into a leader in your community? Are you ready to realize all that you can be, to maximize all of your strengths? Hi, my name is Richard Tyson. You may well know me as an actor in films like Black Hawk Down, 3 O'Clock High, and Kindergarten Cop. And in most movies, I play the bad guy. But in real life, I play a good guy. Because I'm a Shriner. Now, I want to ask you, why are you not already a Shriner? Look, before we move on, I know you're asking yourself, what's with the funny-looking hats? Well, it's actually a fez. And when you see a fez, you know there's a Shriner underneath it, and that's a good thing. Let me tell you how that happened. It all started in New York City in the 1870s at the Knickerbocker Cottage, a restaurant favored by the city's Masons. It was here that the well-known actor William Florence and the prominent physician Walter Fleming decided to form a separate group just to have a little fun and a little fellowship. That was the age of exploration, and the style of the times was one of adventure. So, in keeping with that fashion, Fleming and Florence adopted the flamboyant style of the mysterious East. And thus was born the ancient Arabic order of the nobles at the mystic shrine for North America, known today as Shriners. Original membership, 13 men. Master Masons, all.
The emphasis on friendship and frivolity quickly encouraged others to join in the fun, allowing the Shriners to grow rapidly by forming international temples or chapters. Shriners are a part of the Masonic family, and so to become a Shriner, you must first be a Master Mason. Then you have the opportunity to join a fraternity that has included some of the best-known names in politics, sports, the arts, and industry.
So we're talking about joining one of the two major Masonic rites, either the Scottish Rite or the York Rite, and then working your way up from an apprentice to a Master Mason, and then finally you may have a chance at becoming a Shriner. And no matter which Masonic rite you choose, it all connects back to the United Grand Lodge of England, the oldest Masonic lodge in the world. And when you got people like President Andrew Johnson, King Leopold I, King George IV, and all these other monarchs and world leaders being a part of this organization, what do you think it was really all about? Again, during the formation of the Freemasons, dark-skinned people all over the world have already had their civilizations invaded and in a lot of cases destroyed. And recolonization is taking place all over the planet. And by the 1700s, this colonization has reached America and at this point become a completely worldwide event. And so presumably mission accomplished, right? These people have spread all over the planet, recolonized the planet. And as all this is going on, we're knee deep into the global enslavement of dark-skinned people all over the planet. And you could probably assume generations removed from those original inhabitants of all those lands that were originally defending their civilizations from being invaded. Now we're knee deep into this new generation of enslaved people, people who have been enslaved since birth, people that are inheriting the condition of slavery as soon as they come out of the womb. This is all they know. So the brainwashing is in full effect at this point. And so in the midst of all this happening, this organization is formed amongst all these world leaders who meet secretly to discuss what? Well, I'm going to take an educated guess here to discuss how to keep this thing going, how to maintain control indefinitely, and how to never allow the people that they've conquered to ever regain any type of control, and to also discuss the deeper reasoning behind all of it and what or who is motivating them to do what they're doing. And of course, the Freemasons were an all-white organization. If you weren't white, you wouldn't be accepted in for obvious reasons. So in all these Masonic lodges across the board, you had nothing but white men. But when you take the time to take a closer look at a lot of these men, what you'll notice is that there's so many different phenotypes and facial features among these white men. You got facial features that we would consider Latin, facial features that we would consider Asian, Arabic, Jewish. You've got men with these different facial features that we've come to associate with all these different ethnicities and races who were a part of this whites only organization. And the only thing that they seem to have in common is that all of them have white skin. They all have pheomelanin. It's the one thing they share. So what it seems like is the one major requirement for being a part of this whites only organization is having white skin. Even during this time when things were supposed to be so segregated amongst different ethnicities and races, these people didn't seem to care what size your eyes were or how wide your nose was or whatever. And here's another example of how they got all of us playing into this whole race and ethnicity game while they clearly don't abide by it at all because they know what's really separating human beings. So with this secret whites only organization, they're like, hey, as long as you have pheomelanin, you're good, you're in. The only people that we don't accept are people with eumelanin, people with brown skin. So basically, if you're a part of that gene pool that flooded the planet 6,000 years ago, you're in. You're one of us. If you're not a part of that gene pool, then you're the reason that we even started this thing in the first place. And so, of course, you're not welcome because this is about us having conquered you and us keeping it that way. And again, you can see that with the Shriners and with the way that they modeled the organization around South Asia, the Middle East, and the Fertile Crescent, right where it seems like historically those invasions started. And when you look at the fezzes that they wear, being branded with the names of all these South Asian locations and phrases connected to that particular region. I mean, you got things like Cairo, Al Quran, Arabia, too many to name. All these phrases written on these fezzes that clearly link back to South Asia. And with this being the next level from regular Freemasonry, and like they said, it was created for the Freemasons to have a little fun and fellowship, basically to celebrate. But what are they celebrating? Well, clearly it looks like they're celebrating the genesis or the beginning of their conquest of the planet through the Shriners and celebrating where the human DNA originally mutated to produce them. And it's interesting how they say that there was 13 Master Masons who came together to found the Order of the Mystic Shrine or the Shriners, because some of you know the whole idea of there being just 13 families that literally control everything in the world, the 13 royal families. So you got the 13 royal families, the 13 bloodlines, and then you got the 13 Master Masons who found the Shriners. I'm pretty sure it all connects. And personally, I don't think that every single Mason is in on the ultimate agenda or even knows the full extent of what these organizations are really about. Now, they got to know something, because for you to have to become a Master Mason to even make it this far and call yourself a Shriner, you got to know something. Exactly what they know, that's up for speculation, but they know something. But for the people that originally set these organizations up with whatever original intent that they had, it's no doubt that it means something way deeper to them. And these dudes that we see running around with the fezzes and the hats and all the costumes, these people are serving the purpose of something much bigger than them, especially the Black Masons. I mean, first off, this organization started as whites only, which tells you everything you need to know right there. I mean, even white women were allowed to be around these secret societies. I mean, this is before women's liberation and the feminist movement, back when white women were basically looked at as second class. Even white women were allowed to be around these secret societies and allowed to start their own lodges. They considered their lodges clandestine, which basically means that the Grand Lodge of England didn't acknowledge their lodges, but they were still allowed to run these lodges. White women. And it took almost 70 years for them to allow one black man, Prince Hall, to run his own Freemasonic lodge. And even then they said, look, you can run your own lodge, but it has to be separate from us. Our lodges are still whites only. No Negroes allowed. So you can do your thing over there while we do our thing over here. And it's just crazy that you would even have black people that would so badly want to be a part of something that looks like it's clearly not in the best interest of their own people. And here's the crazy part. Even when they were allowed their own lodges, which had to be separate of the whites only lodges, you still had white Freemasons assigned to these Prince Hall lodges or these black lodges. And I think it's pretty easy to see why they would do this. Of course, we don't want you anywhere near our lodges when we're having these secret meetings, because the secret meetings, 9 times out of 10, are about you. But we'll send some of our already established Masons over to kind of oversee things with your lodges. Make sure everything's running smooth. Who am I kidding? We're sending them over to monitor your meetings, to see what you're talking about, and to make sure you're not getting out of pocket. Yeah, I know you already swore the oath. You already pretty much proved your loyalty to us, but we need to be sure. So to really be one of us, you'll have to keep one of us around. I mean, to be one, ask one, right? You guys understand? Now, how deep does this thing go? That's hard to say, but one thing that we definitely do know is that the people who originally established the Freemasons answer to something or someone greater than them. And you can see that through how they require anybody seeking to be a Freemason to believe in and to answer to a supreme being, a God. And it doesn't matter what God you believe in, but in order to be initiated into Freemasonry, you have to believe in a God. So it doesn't matter if you're Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. As long as you believe in a God, you've met the first requirement of becoming a Freemason. Now, remember, the Shriners is a higher level of Freemasonry. And we know a shrine is a place that's dedicated to a divine being or a God. And here we have within the higher levels of Freemasonry, the Shriners. So a Shriner would be an individual who completely dedicates themselves to the will of a God. And it's obvious that this is a big part of what Freemasonry is really about when you get deeper into it. Because even when you look at the other higher levels of Freemasonry outside of the Shriners, you'll see that you have the Masonic Order of the Knights Templar. And we know that historically the Knights Templar was centered around forcing the God of the Roman Catholic Church onto all of these ancient civilizations through a military force that was officially backed up by the Pope and the Church. And right here with the Freemasons, you have the Masonic Order of the Knights Templar, which, just like the Shriners, requires you to go through all these levels of Freemasonry before you can even be considered for the Knights Templar. I mean, you literally have to complete 10 different Masonic degrees before you can even move up to become a Knights Templar. And then I think it's pretty clear, just like the Shriners, the Knights Templar is celebrating another aspect of the conquering and recolonization of the people who were already here on the planet. Because you can see they're clearly celebrating the conversion of these people over to the Abrahamic religions and celebrating successfully getting these people to give their devotion and energy up to the gods of the Roman Catholic Church. But if it's really about these gods, who are these gods? Who are the gods of Freemasonry? Well, of course, they're not going to give it to you direct, but we can get kind of an idea by looking at the constitutions of the Masons under the Grand Lodge of England. These constitutions that they claim were established at the original formation of the Freemasons. And you can actually go to the website for the United Grand Lodge of England and look at these constitutions. So if you scroll down to the section for craft rules, and we can get a look at the general charges, laws, and regulations of the free and accepted Masons. And we turn the page over to the aims and relationships of the craft. And we go down to number 3, and immediately it's what we already know. The first condition of admission into and membership of the order is a belief in the supreme being. This is essential and admits no compromise. And of course, the supreme being is in reference to God. But what God? They're not giving you any details here. It's just the supreme being. So then if we go down to number 4, it says the Bible, referred to by Freemasons as the volume of the sacred law, is always open in the lodges. Every candidate is required to take his obligation on that book or on the volume, which is held by his particular creed, to impart sanctity to an oath or promise taken upon it. So every single Masonic lodge has a Bible in it. And you just got to think clearly, this thing goes way deeper than just the Bible alone for the Freemasons, because you can see that through the Shriners paying homage to Islam and the Quran. And also based off the fact that depending on which Masonic lodge you go into, the volume of the sacred law can be any one of the religious texts. The Bible, the Quran, the Vedas. It just so happens that you find the Bible in the majority of the lodges in America and Europe. But again, for the Freemasons, it doesn't matter which God you choose or which religion you choose. As long as you profess yourself to one of these gods, you've taken the first step of becoming a Freemason. And think about this. If it's just about them dedicating themselves to these religions, then why not just go to a church or a mosque or a temple to practice these religions? Why are they doing it in secret? Because there's something more to these gods than they're telling me and you. So if we go ahead and turn the page here over to the Antient Charges and Regulations, antient being another word for ancient. So they're saying this is literally the ancient charges and regulations of the Freemasons. And go down to number 5. You can see it says you agree to hold in veneration the original rulers and patrons of the order of Freemasonry and their regular successors, supreme and subordinate, according to their stations, and to submit to the awards and resolutions of your brethren in general lodge convened in every case consistent with the constitutions of the order. So who are the original rulers? What are they talking about? Is there a chance that we could be talking about the original human beings? And does it have anything to do with the original man that Message to the Black Man talks about? Notice that it says that the Freemasons are required to hold these original rulers in veneration. And veneration can be another way of saying to worship. So what exactly are they talking about here? Well, let's keep going and see. So if we flip the page and continue looking into the Antient Charges, and you go to number 8, it says, you promise to respect genuine and true brethren and to discountenance impostors and all dissenters from the original plan of Freemasonry. So hold up, what's the original plan? And does the original plan have anything to do with the original rulers? But then the question still remains, who are the gods of Freemasonry? Who are the original rulers? Who is the supreme being? And are they telling us who these gods are in plain sight? Because when you look at the symbol for Freemasonry, most people are familiar with it. You got the compass on top, the ruler on the bottom, and in the middle, you have the letter G. Now, one of the big mysteries is, what does that G stand for? Well, a lot of people think it stands for God. You've got the Freemasons who say it stands for the great architect of the universe, and also for geometry, because geometry would have played a huge role in shaping the universe as we know it. And this is why you also have the compass and the ruler, which would seem to make sense with all these references to a supreme being by the Freemasons. But looking at everything that we've gone over so far, and looking at how secretive the Freemasons are and have always been since the beginning, I think it's a strong possibility that we're dealing with something else, something not so obvious, and that the G is actually alluding to the Gnostics. Now, the term Gnostic actually has its roots in the Proto-Indo-European language. So this is going back to the ancient Middle East and the barbarian tribes. And coming from Proto-Indo-European, the term Gnostic literally means to know. This is a big part of Freemasonry. The idea that they know things that we don't, and that they keep this knowledge hidden amongst themselves. Now, historically, they say that the Gnostics were this ancient group of radical thinking people who followed this ideology called Gnosticism. And through Gnosticism, they believed that while there was one supreme God that existed above and beyond existence, that underneath this supreme God was this divine hierarchy of lower gods, and that one of these lower gods that they referred to as the demiurge was responsible for the formation of the universe that we currently live in right now, and that this demiurge appointed himself above the true supreme God, and that this demiurge was literally the embodiment of falsehood and evil. And so they basically believed that this material world, every single form of matter, because it was created by this lower being, this lower God, was evil, including the human body. And so they believed that we ultimately needed to be saved from this universe and from our human bodies. And that the only way to do that was to gain salvation of our spirits within our human bodies through the secret knowledge of Gnosticism, or Gnosis, the esoteric knowledge of the spiritual truth of the Gnostics, which when you look at the spelling is eerily similar to Genesis. Now, they say that Gnosticism was a really prominent religion first in the Middle East before spreading to Rome. But when the Gnostic concept died, it died fast. And the Gnostics pretty much fell into obscurity. And so just as quickly as they say they started in the 1st century AD, they say that they ended and disappeared in the 7th century AD. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think the Gnostics went anywhere, because I believe the Gnostics were the barbarian tribes, and that the Gnostics are nothing more than the Freemasons, and that this lower God that they say created the universe is actually their God, the God of the Freemasons, the great architect of the universe, and that this great architect is actually multiple beings, multiple gods. Hit the notification button and you'll get updated as soon as a new video drops.
Mm-hmm.